People, this week we've got Raj Laly of Lalys Pharmacy and the JCL Group.
So I think the difficulty with the NHS now is the workforce is finding it really challenging. If you're in a work environment, you're not enjoying it, you're either going to leave the profession or you may just naturally go purely private. The reason why some people have said private's quite expensive is, because it is. We're not a country that's geared up for it. But if other providers started opening up, by the nature of market competition, your pricing would probably adjust a little bit, and then it does become accessible to a few more people. But I think we can learn from some of the things they do abroad, because individuals sometimes may have more of awareness of where they need to access bits of healthcare because they have to. Whereas I think sometimes here we just default of, I'm just going to see my GP for this, or I'm just going to go to A&E, and we're not really thinking of, what do we really need to do that?
Raj.
Yes. Hello.
Welcome to the What's Going On show.
Thank you. Yeah, great to be here.
No, exciting times. Exciting times. And cool. So cool. A little bit about the show. So the show, What's Going On show, is the show where we shine a light on people doing things in communities, and arguably you're doing quite a massive thing in the community, and your family are too. And today we just unpick a bit and kind of have a peek in and see what's happening.
Yeah, look forward to it.
Cool.
Yeah.
So a little tradition I've got on this show
Yes.
is, instead of me giving you an introduction, I like to give it over to you. So who in a nutshell is Raj Laly?
Oh, that's a good question. So I professionally, I've sort of trained to be a GP now. So and I've been a GP for a number of years. But more of late, I've sort of got quite involved in pharmacy. So we've got sort of Lalys Pharmacy businesses in sort of the area and sort of wider area. I really love sort of my family life. Married to a beautiful wife, Priya, and I have two lovely kids, Kumvo, who's 11, and Amita, who's 9. And another part of my life is sport. I'm quite well involved in sport and things. So one of the clubs that I'm sort of quite involved with at the moment, and for a number of years, is Havant Hockey Club, and hockey's always been sort of a sport I've been interested, as well as some other sports. So that's probably a reasonable sort of overview of myself, I think. I mean, we could go into more things, but that's sort of me in a nutshell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, interesting.
Yeah.
So, where did you grow up? Portsmouth?
Yeah, grew up in Portsmouth. I was born in St Mary's, so grew up in Portsmouth. I in my sort of earlier years actually lived in Fareham, but sort of Portsmouth has always been a mainstay, probably because of my sort of parents, where they sort of had their initial sort of pharmacies in Portsmouth. I remember as a kid, sort of in theory, sort of almost growing up in the pharmacies and things in the back room, because that's how you sort of had to sort of look after me in many ways, and I sort of was there. But in Portsmouth, sort of primarily, definitely, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So you grew up in pharmacies.
It probably is not allowed now from regulation perspective. So, but I think it's just how things were done a little bit in those days. So. Getting childcare probably for my parents was a bit difficult. Times were sort of tricky for them. They were both born in Kenya, so in East Africa. So they came here to study, and obviously eventually got married. And from their sort of life, they were sort of starting from sort of nothing really. So at that time, obviously, when they had sort of me. It was sort of quite difficult to sort of get sort of childcare and those sort of things, especially when they're starting up. So I know there was a pharmacy that we had in sort of Farnham, or my parents had in Farnham, and there was a bit upstairs there where I know there was almost like a little mini sort of child area or creche thing that my mum had, and apparently I used to be there lots of times, and she could sort of go up and down, all those sort of things. But even in our branch, which we still have in Kingston Road in Buckland, I remember going there a lot, sort of after school and things like that, and wait for them to finish and then go home afterwards. So there's and we still have some staff members that can remember me when I was sort of the younger age and things. So grew up in pharmacies, not sort of literally, but a lot of my time was sort of spent there. and just sort of knew the goings on or what happened in sort of pharmacies and things. So yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So when was the sort of first pharmacy open then? Was it when you were born or?
So I believe it was sort of just. So I was born in '84, so it was before that. So sort of like '81, '82, sort of that sort of period. So yeah, that was sort of the first one, and it was at Kingston Road, so in Buckland, and I think it was a smaller branch then, and then it sort of got a bit bigger in sort of size to what it is now. But yeah, that was the first one. My father's always been quite into sort of business and always was an ideas man, and it wasn't the only thing he got involved in. He had sort of brothers as well that was sort of similar in terms of starting from new, and him and his brothers were getting involved in lots of different things, so whether that be property as well, and he got involved in, and my father got involved a bit in manufacturing of healthcare goods and things like that, so they were just sort of doing everything and anything at that time. But pharmacies were the main thing for him, and obviously what that's sort of grown into sort of in current times as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you grew up with being exposed to a pharmacy.
Yeah.
So school life and sport. How was school for you then?
School was good. And I have to really thank my parents for that one. I think my mum didn't really know or understand a lot of the schooling system here. She grown up in Kisumu, which is on the equator in Kenya. So completely different schooling. But she got used to the British schooling system there because Kenya was a British colony at that time, and she grew up in that sort of schooling there in a Catholic school, I believe. And then where we were living in Fareham, there was a school right where we lived called Boundary Oak, which was a preparatory school, and I think it reminded her of her schooling and upbringing. And that was my first school. So I went to prep school there, and I believe she says they had to almost lower the age because of me, because she was desperate to send me there. And thankfully there were some other parents with kids of a similar age. And I think now to this day, I think it starts at 2.5 or something. So I was sort of there from the age of 2.5 because she was working almost sort of quite quickly. And my aunts and could only look after me for so long, that's where I went, and that was a great school for me because it was a school where I got involved with lots of sport, whether it be rugby, which my parents' family have got no clue about rugby, but I became a fairly decent rugby player, and it was thankful to that school. And I always laugh at my parents because to this day they never ever watched one game of me play rugby, but I did well at it. And then other sports I got involved with there as well, whether it be cricket, and then hockey I was also pushed into as well through the family anyway. So,
okay, interesting. Yeah. What position would you play rugby?
So I just used to go in the scrum. So I was in a scrum. So obviously, I was always fairly tall for my sort of year group and those sort of things. So I wouldn't have been the most dynamic or fast sort of rugby player, and because a lot of players played club rugby as well, I think to almost put me in the scrum was okay, and then they could develop me that way. But I think it became a natural position for me, and then eventually I went into sort of lock. So I was sort of a lock player in rugby, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. I played rugby even probably up to the age of 15, 16 when I had to sort of pick where am I going to go with sport wise, but. Yeah, I always enjoyed rugby. It was great fun.
It is a great sport. Isn't
it?
I remember playing with that for years.
Yes.
It was a great sport.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So preparatory school. So how, I don't know if you know, how does it differ from normal public schools?
Yeah, and so I didn't know that at the time because I was quite naive in my own world and just thought that was sort of normal sort of schooling. We used to have like assemblies. It used to be quite strict. I remember if you were told off, you had to like face the wall, and stuff like that. And I don't think they do that now. But it was a bit like that. There were boarders there. I wasn't boarding, so I was daytime. But there were some children there that used to board, and I think they had a lot of children that their parents were associated with the forces, say the Navy and things like that, and they would, and a lot of them would happen to be boarders and things. But in terms of different to sort of public schools, I think or state schools, it was probably the extracurricular activities. I think was good, that I found was really good. And I had cousins that went to Cams Hill, which is in Fareham, which is a state school, and they maybe didn't do as much as the sports that maybe I had done and things, and I could be left there for longer in the days, if you see what I mean, because it was a boarding school. So I wasn't boarding, but if there were clubs that I needed to stay on till 5 or 6 o'clock, that's something that could happen, and that's what my parents certainly took advantage of. Not in a bad way, but I think it just helped them, and it probably gave my mum relief, because she couldn't necessarily always do the drop-offs or the pick-ups at sort of 3 or half 3. Whereas if she knew there was a school that I would be at for long periods of the day, then so be it. I had to go to Saturday school as well. There was Saturday school. It wasn't like a long Saturday. It was often like, from what I recall, like 2-3 hours, and then you play sports. So if you think about it from their perspective, they're like, right, my child is there in a safe environment, and they were there for a long periods of the day. But they were working hard, because obviously it's fee paying and that's expensive, and they were working a lot of hours for that to just sort of help me to get in there. I think it was just, she just felt, because it's what she had grew up with in Kenya, where it had been a sort of a system where she thinks was sort of similar to what Boundary Oak was with the one I went to, and I think it just sort of reassured her a little bit, because she came to this country and didn't really understand, and that was what she just sort of geared towards, I think. So yeah.
Interesting. So, okay, that was interesting. So, just on that then, while you was going through school, so you're an ethnic minority, basically. Or
Yeah.
You say that right? So what was it like going to school as, I don't know how to call it, as an ethnic minority in those days?
I don't think, it's a really interesting question. I don't think I truly understood at that time. It wasn't, so I probably have more open conversations with my kids now than maybe my parents would have then, because it was all quite new for them as well. So they'd come from East Africa. It was, around that time there was obviously the Idi Amin thing around Uganda, and they sort of left. They didn't really want to leave, but they sort of had to, because East Africa was becoming a bit unstable at that time. Then they've come to a new country, and it's all very different. So they didn't really have time to, and I think it was maybe just society that time. You wouldn't necessarily sit down with your kids and have those sort of conversations. So I think at Boundary Oak I was just sort of figuring it out a little bit myself. I could see I was a different skin colour. Clearly, that's just one of those things you just see. My name I was aware of, so my full name is Raj Deep, and I always used to slightly cringe and get a heart sink moment, because when you go through the register, for some reason everyone just gets the Raj and then the Deep, and they see it, and then people just weren't able to pronounce it, or they'll go Rajeep, or they'll say a different name, and I just used to feel really embarrassed. And then my friends would laugh, not at me. I think they used to laugh at the teacher, but I used to think, oh, it's because of me. So I think you just became a little bit more aware. I remember there was one rugby game where I definitely became aware, where they were like, and I don't think anyone had malice, but we must have been like 9 or 10, and they were like, tackle the brown guy, and then I was like, who are they saying? Oh, me, and it was done like in it, and then I then was like a little bit put back by that. So I think you're almost sort of learning a little bit by experience. So I don't think it was, I never can say at that age in that school I got obvious racism, or but it was just the subtleties that you just start to notice and become aware of, and those things. I think those things just happen. And maybe for me at that time, I wasn't really having the conversation with parents, and I think if I did, they would have been fine. But it's just not how things were done there. So yeah, there was definitely an awareness piece. But at the same time, I was doing all right at the school. I was doing well from education-wise, sports, and those sort of things. So I didn't necessarily look at it sort of negatively at all. It was just sort of learning as you went along. So there was definitely an awareness. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So you've gone through school, sportsman, doing well. Did you always know that you was going into healthcare?
I think I sort of did. I think maybe through my upbringing, like I said, I was based a lot in pharmacies. I think it was just a natural progression towards it. I didn't personally want to be a pharmacist, and maybe that was just sometimes how we're geared up as kids, that we don't necessarily always want to do the same as our parents. And in my head, I just programmed into wanting to become a doctor and a GP. So, and it was just what I had seen. So that's what really interested me. So, and then when I went to, so after Boundary Oak, I went to Portsmouth Grammar, and then I really started to enjoy maths and the science subjects, and it's what I gravitated towards most. So it became a natural thing for me. And then doing medicine then became my focus, probably fairly early. I think almost from the age of 12, 13, I was like, that's what I'm going to be. And then I was just gearing up on that and making sure I concentrated the most on those subjects, maybe to the annoyance of some other subject teachers. But I just started focusing a lot more on those. Yeah.
Would you say it's quite important to know what you want to do from an early age, or?
I found it important for me. Maybe my, like we were just saying before, the discussions I had with my parents and the sort of upbringing was a little bit different. So I was always told, you need to set yourself up. You have to do something that you are, you can be independent, you can pay for yourself, and I was always just pushed towards a profession, and that was just the way I was sort of brought into, and that's all my parents knew. But I know the conversation I have with my kids is very different. My daughter's very good at sort of art, and she's very good at sort of doing drawings and designing things. So I'm having a very different conversation to her. Whereas maybe with my parents, if I was good at that, they might have still pushed me towards certain industries and things. But for me, it was good. It focused my mind. Maybe, like we just said, for an ethnic minority at that time, didn't quite know their place. It was a good thing to have that focus, and it kept me disciplined. So I think it was good for me, definitely. Yeah.
Interesting. Fair enough. So cool. You've gone through school. You get into medical school. Well, where was that, and how was that?
Yeah, medical school was really good fun. So I went to Barton Royal London Hospital, which is part of Queen Mary's College. So that's sort of east end of London, so Barbican, but also sort of Whitechapel area. And it was really good. It was a real eye opener. I sort of hardly really left Portsmouth, bar sort of hockey things that I did, and hockey really showed me the world. But in terms of like going to London and trips and things, I never used to really do that with family or parents and things. So when I'm suddenly in London, living there, being independent, not reliant on parents, it was a real learning experience and something that I needed to go through. But I loved it. I really liked medical school. I liked the things around medical school, whether it is sort of looking after yourself in sort of accommodation and sorting out your own food and making sure your clothes are all sorted, all those sort of bits, opening up a bank account, all those things you just had to do, to also the medical school itself, which was great fun because you have to be disciplined. It's only you turning up, no one else. You have to turn up to lectures, to tutorials, all those sort of bits, and you have to learn. There's no way, and there's exams. So I really enjoyed it. People always think it's sort of a long time, it'll be 4 or 5 years, and the years afterwards. But you don't necessarily look at it that way when you're in sort of medical school and even post medical school. So I really look at that as sort of fond memories. So it was really, really good fun.
Interesting. So okay, on that then. So are you a religious man?
I would. I believe in a God, so I would say yes. There's belief there. I wouldn't say I'm sort of devoutly religious, but yeah, I it's something I've always sort of been brought up with. Yeah.
Okay, so no, the reason I asked that is, so do you drink alcohol?
I do, yeah.
So a big topic, or whatever you want to call it, that I've always heard at medical school is the drinking culture, and a lot of students have this drinking culture because to get through it. That's what I've heard. Now, is that apparent? Is that a thing?
There was drink, so there was alcohol around, and I used, I would have a drink. I didn't feel forced into it, and they were maybe with some societies they were at that time, and I don't know what it is now per se. But I remember with sort of the hockey or the rugby teams or the football teams, after their Wednesdays at sports, there would be a fair bit of drinking. But with the hockey, I remember that I just used to say to I don't want to get involved in this, I'm okay. I was playing hockey at a fairly sort of high level at that time, and I was sort of more mindful of drinking and drinking excessively and being sort of good on the body and all those bits, which we're even more aware of now, I think, as a society now. So yeah, there was alcohol around, but it never felt forced at that time. And I think times have continued to change for the positive. So there certainly was a lot around. But yeah, I didn't see people go sort of crazy, but yeah, there is a bit of that where people might just need it to sort of settle. What I sort of found is often after exams and a period of real high workload, people just need to release, and maybe that would be in like a party or the union, that sort of stuff, and that's probably where it sort of came into. But you just couldn't get away with drinking too often, too regularly there, because you have to do a lot of work. So it's more when people just let their hair down when they've come off sort of regular testing, which is what you have at med school. Yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, to become a doctor or in the medical field or the healthcare field, you have to go to university.
Yeah,
but looking at university now that you've gone through it, for people who aren't going into, say, law or healthcare or them sort of areas, or engineering, what would you say the value of university is?
The biggest value is to become a bit more independent. So again, that might depend on how you've grown up. So some people might not need it, but I did. So I sort of grown up with my parents, and a fair bit of things were sort of done for me at that time. But then to go out into med school and, if I was living in halls first, and I remember our halls were very different to probably how some halls are now. We had the building was not going to last for long, I believe, and we had nine boys on a floor, and there was one shower. So just everything around that of in the morning, and you're like queuing up. It's almost like an old dorm, and you're sort of queuing up to get ready for a shower, or you just sort of almost worked out your timings. Or even the kitchen was very small, and it's sort of fridge space. So even just those things of learning how to deal with other people in tricky scenarios, and similar with sort of sharing a house or shared a house. There were 4 of us in a house, and splitting bills and who's going to take responsibility of that, and buying food, and there might be some cheese, for example. There was like a few cheese incidents of who's had my cheese and all this sort of stuff. So you can't beat that. And so that's like life experience, because you learn that in real life, in the real world, whether it's in work or other bits of society. And I think in university, when I was suddenly away from home, that taught me a lot of how to deal with other people. And I don't think you realise at the time. It's only when you reflect back on it that you think, yeah, that was really good, and there are some tricky moments that you get through, but it's almost like you have to learn a little bit, and then when you're sort of younger and going through that, I found that really good to sort of learn from that. I know it's stood me in good stead now. Yeah.
No, fair enough.
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. You've gone through university. Did you go straight into becoming a GP, or?
Yeah. So after you go to university, once you've done med school, you go into a foundation year program. So I, which is 2 years, and that's still the case now. So I did my foundation year program. So year 1, I did in London. Unfortunately, around that time, we had a sort of a family. There was just some sudden bad news in the family. So I had a brother. My brother suddenly passed at the age of 21. He was in med school as well. So and I had actually got married around that time. It was very close to when it happened. So suddenly we got that awful news, and it just came out the woodwork. Like, life was good. I just got married, and we were living in London. My wife was there as well, and suddenly we got that bad news. So I made a conscious decision with my wife that we need to come back to Portsmouth, because I need to take care of my parents. That's just how I was brought up. Like what we were saying before, they invested a lot of time into me. I needed to make sure they were good, because it was quite tricky. So I took a year out of medicine at that time, and I was sort of fighting with the career in my head. I was like, I don't want to do this, because my brother was going to do this. He was in med school, and why should I? So now dedicate my life to this, because there were a lot of mixed emotions. And then at that time, we were just talking a bit brief off air. I actually went into do like a business course at University of Portsmouth, which was completely different to med school. And I found that was like therapy for me, because I was suddenly, I was in science, and then suddenly I'm in a complete different world of business. And I remember in that it was to do an MBA, and I was with, and that bit was all fine, but it was the people I was with at that time that had no idea about me, being a doctor in med school and everything around it. And then suddenly I was dealing with the emotions of that, and I was in University of Portsmouth, and that was really good. And there were people that had come from all over the world to study, and I was interacting with them. So I took that year out and did that, and then went back once I'd finished that to complete my year 2 foundation year. And there were some really supportive people that helped me at that time around Queen Alexandra Hospital, tutors, because I was grappling about continuing with the career, and there were some people that really helped me to just sort of continue, because I remember my first rotations I sort of struggled with, but they sort of kept me going through it. So there could have been someone that might have left the profession, but there were people there that just sort of supported me and went through it. I remember I did one rotation in general practice in Havant, and there was one GP there that was just great, and I was like, that moment I was like, I want to be a GP. So after the 2 years of foundation year, I know it was interrupted with the unfortunate sort of news of my brother. 2 years of foundation year, and then you go into specialty training, and general practice is 3 years. So I then did that. So so I was officially a GP in, what was it, 2012, 2013, that sort of time. So yeah.
Wow. So you hit that. Yeah, that all of a sudden, that must have been big on the family.
It was, yeah. We've so brother and I, we lived in London as well for a period. So there was a bit where we overlapped, where we were both in med school. So it did hit hard. So people often used to think we were twins, so we were similar height. He was a bit taller. When you get a sudden thing of someone no longer being there, and your lives are a little bit intertwined, it is quite difficult. And sort of trauma that happens in sort of families or people or events is really quite difficult, and knowing how to deal with that at the moment. And I would say there were probably things I did wrong at that time, but yeah, my focus then was to really focus on my parents and make sure they're okay, because I think they were worried about me, making sure I would be okay. So it was a bit of everything. Bearing in mind I was also married, so my wife was dealing with all the difficulties there. So it was a tricky period, but I think we all get that in life, and it's just knowing how you can get through it. And I always just sort of say to my kids and wife, like, make the most of today, because you never know what can happen tomorrow. And something like that just came out of nowhere. So yeah, it was definitely a difficult time. But you just in life, I think you just got to get through with it, because when you're walking, in the street and things, no one really knows. You have to sort of deal with things there and then. But obviously there are moments where we have setbacks, and we sometimes just need time to get through it. Yeah.
Okay, so you met that person, haven't they? They gave you the hope to become a GP. So when you became a GP, was it what you expected?
Yeah, I think so. I've always liked, the reason why I liked general practice when I was with that doctor from Havant was I also like, so often in general practice we see the GP, we get an appointment, we see the GP, I've got a sore throat, other things, and then that's it. But it's not just like that. In general practice, you can do lots of other things. So there's the business aspect of it in the background. So the NHS is contracting GPs independently, so it's essentially like their own business. Then they're contracted to carry out NHS services, so they've got to manage the business aspect of it in the background, which I always found quite interesting. But also GPs can do other things. So in the surgery I was involved with, I was a partner for 10 years in Swan Surgery in Petersfield. Got involved with looking after community wards for a number of years. So, if someone has been discharged from hospital but they still need some community care and medical care, they will often go into sort of a community hospital type setting. And I remember in Swan Surgery, where we used to do medical cover for those community wards. I have got, and I still am actually involved in medical care for mental health patients in a mental health facility, where these are patients that are sort of sectioned or have other reasons to be in this facility, but they need medical care. So general practice or a GP doesn't just have to be a GP in a GP surgery. They can also do other things, and that's what I liked about it for me, the dynamism that you can do lots of other things in healthcare, not solely GP in a GP surgery, and that's what sort of warmed me to it as well.
There's many things to a GP then.
Yes, there is. I've got I got fairly involved in COVID times, so I was also a director of what we call the Alliance then. So you get groups of GP surgeries that have essentially formed a company, so that those surgeries or surgeries in our area can then bid to get sort of larger NHS contracts and things. So with the view that it's going to help the area, because then rather than just get another organisation or company that hasn't really got association with the area, you're getting local GPs that are doing it. So I was a director of Southern Health Primary Care Alliance, and when I was a director there, COVID happened, and then and it was like, ooh, and with that alliance, me and there was a nurse that was really sort of helpful as well, called Aisa, and we got involved with COVID clinics. So obviously there was the move to try to, which was the right move, to try to manage people in the community as much as you can, and make sure only the patients who are obviously getting quite unwell with COVID go into hospital, so they've got the right pathway. So we set that up for the area with the Alliance, and that was really quite high paced. It was a lot of pressure. We obviously hear a lot of things politically of what things have been done in COVID and what went wrong, and it felt like that in the NHS. There was a lot of what should and shouldn't happen. There was no set rule of these are how these clinics should be, and yeah, that was definitely quite high pressure at that time, because we had to do things, we had to do it quickly, and we had to do it right, and the people had perception of what right was. So yeah, I got involved with that, and even around just before that time, we worked with Queen Alexandra Hospital, called sort of A&E redirections. What we're trying to do is redirect patients away from A&E back into primary healthcare. So you want the correct patients to go into A&E, and it was done with that sort of remit. So a GP being there and redirecting them out back into surgery or to another clinic. So yeah, got really quite involved with that in sort of other things. So yeah, that has been really interesting as well. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, you said there that the NHS didn't really know how to deal with it, and the government didn't know how to deal with it. That's one side. But since COVID, has it ever recovered?
I mean, the system's still struggling. So we always hear through politics about waiting lists and those sort of things that clearly are a bit of a problem, but we can't just sort of dismiss that COVID never happened. It was there, and if you think of when COVID happened, things stopped, and they stopped for a period, and by the nature of that, you're going to get a backlog, and that takes time. So especially if you've just gone back into normal system, it's not like sort of other things have opened up. Now there could be debates about how to get those lists down, whether it's tapping into other bits of the healthcare system, private care, or other bits that are needed. But clearly with the system as it is now, and if there is a backlog of lots of things that need to happen, whether that's sort of hip replacements, whether it's other sort of medical procedures, is going to take a lot of time to get through that backlog, because clearly disease or health issues, those sort of things continue. So it's not like that's going to have a pause. So you've got a backlog that's built, and then you're back into sort of normal things. Now, whether it was right to pause everything is another question. So I would hope if there is ever a pandemic in the future, which looking at history will happen, whether it happens in our lifetime is another question. I would hope there's a better strategy in how to deal with those things, whatever pandemic that might be. Yeah.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you're a GP for many years. You're doing the Care Alliance. So you said in the beginning that property was in the property was also there.
Yeah.
So when did that come around for you?
Yeah, property, and I thank my dad for that in many ways, or it's something he sort of just pushed me towards. I think it's something that he got into when he was sort of doing everything and anything. Like we said, when they had moved to this country and they were looking for opportunities. So I think they looked at it at that time to obviously, buy a property, and then they must have thought at that time actually this could be good investments and those sort of things. But I think it was more of a hobby, just something a little bit on the side, how someone might have a buy to let, those type of things. But when I came back to the area in between my foundation years, I needed to get a lot very much involved with the business. Obviously my parents were going through what they were, and I suddenly had to sort of take control of a lot of things because they were dealing with the loss of their child, in essence. So and that's when I witnessed that world a lot more. So I wouldn't have said that it was my focus at that time. I was sort of going into med school or I had to come out of med school, and I was going to be a GP and all these sort of things, but suddenly I had to take control of things. So I sort of learned probably the hard way, and then but by getting involved with it, I would like to think that it was slowly sort of maybe changing how they were dealing with how they dealt with property compared to how I did. And then I just sort of grew it in that way. And there were some natural things that happened. There were probably some investments we got involved with that tied into our healthcare business, where we needed to be co-located to a surgery, for example, or we needed to redevelop an existing pharmacy, or we saw an opportunity for where a pharmacy could be. And then suddenly getting some buildings through that healthcare bit, it sort of happened a bit side by side. And even there have been some developments that we've done around Portsmouth that, if you look at the true finances, might not have been the best thing to do, but because we sort of knew the area, we thought let's do it and do it for the long run. And it's sort of making the area a bit better and those sort of things. So it's a bit of both, and it's just something that we ended up enjoying, because I think in a way with property, if you're looking after sort of tenants and you want them to have a good experience and you want to be for them when things go down and boilers, that sort of stuff, then that's so important. We've got a good property team, and my wife always laughs because things do go wrong in house, isn't it? Whether it's boiler, that sort of stuff. But if our boiler goes down at home, it might take days for it to get fixed, whereas if it's a tenant in a property, I always say to our team, get it sorted quick, because it's important. Someone else that is relying on you to get that sorted, and yeah, I wouldn't say everything always works out well, or as well as it could do, but it's just that sort of focus to get that done and done correctly. And yeah, so it has been something that's been really interesting, and regulation of it is ever changing, mostly for good, I think, and I think that's a good thing. But yeah, it's just something I've just naturally just got involved with as well, which is so different to healthcare, but can have similarities in some ways, because we have people that are living in sort of vulnerable positions or have issues with sort of finances, those sort of things. So you've got to make decisions of what can and can't be done in those sort of situations as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So people in hard situations, going back to pharmacies.
Yes.
So first of all, how does a pharmacy work then? How does that work? How is a pharmacy opened?
Yeah, so we obviously have the NHS here. So with pharmacies in this country, you can get private pharmacies. So they can be there, but you're not going to see many of them around in England. But in order for a pharmacy to really remain sort of financially viable, it's sensible to have an NHS contract. So the NHS, essentially, we have a contract with the NHS to carry out pharmacy services. The main service is dispensing of medication. So when you go to your GP and you need to be on a medication, we'll get a prescription as a pharmacy, and we'll dispense that, and you as a patient will get that, whether you're on inhalers or blood pressure medications, those sort of things. And the NHS will reimburse us for that medication. So it would be the value of the medication. That can vary. Sometimes it can be less, sometimes it can be more, and also a slight value on the service, where it's the dispensing fee. So yeah, that's how it works, and the mainstay of the income normally is the dispensing fee income. But there's lots of other things now pharmacies are doing, services, whether it be there's something called Pharmacy First recently. So if you have sore throats, sinusitis, those sort of things, you can go to a pharmacy. Contraception service, emergency contraception service, blood pressure checks. So more and more things are coming into pharmacy now, which is to take away pressure from general practice, hospitals, those sort of things. So it is evolving, but the main service is what we know is really dispensing. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, a bit off topic, but not really.
Yeah.
So I had a guest recently, and we asked this question, and it was, why are sanitary products not free, but some contraceptives are?
Yes.
What's your views on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a very good question. And I don't see any reason why sanitary can't be free, really. I mean, there have been some services. There sometimes is chopping and changing of services that are free. So, for example, in the area here in Portsmouth, there was a time where even things like sort of paracetamol, those sort of things, could be free, but now that's no longer the case. But I think in terms of sanitary products, particularly for individuals that are sort of finding it financially really difficult, there is real sense for it to maybe be free. So I think that's a really sort of good sort of question to pose, or sort of query why that's not the case. And contraception has just been something that sort of come into it in terms of it being free, and ensure that there is access, and same with emergency sort of contraception, those type of things. Obviously, if you're looking further down the line, it's to sort of stop scenarios where there's sort of abortions happening too far down the line, or sort of unwanted pregnancies too far down the line. So it's to ensure people get really good access to those services, and less fearful of it. But I see no reason why, if it was something the NHS or social care sort of sector, maybe through the council, could implement those things for an area, whether it becomes something for England. But yeah, it could be something that could be incorporated. There's no reason why it can't. It's just making sure whoever commissions it, whether it is the NHS or whether it is through council budgets, think that is a definite need, and make sure it's commissioned in the right way, because clearly it's the vulnerable, people that or people that have real difficulty in accessing those products that definitely should have it, or be able to have it. So yeah, no, I agree with that one. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so pharmacies then, they're kind of like corner shops with an NHS licence in a way. Hear me out. So by that I mean you can see anything, right? You can see people at their worst, people that high up, well off, whatever. What are some of the stories that the public wouldn't hear about that you've heard with pharmacies, and what have you heard that goes on?
Yeah, I mean, you are frontline, so you are there, and I remember even when sort of COVID happened, and suddenly we're all to stay at home, and me and my GP hat on, GP surgeries did, close the doors, and access into surgeries became quite tricky. You had to call in, and you had to sort of, if you only need to come in, you'd be brought in or be managed on the phone. Pharmacies didn't do that and couldn't do that. So, and I remember going in there, drawing up lines on the floor about the direction of where people could go, and put up perspex screens and all those sort of things. So pharmacies really have to, they're on the front line, and unfortunately when you are on the front line, you also get some of the negative bits that can come with it. So we hear in sort of retail there's lots of theft, there's lots of bad behaviour, and pharmacies aren't immune to that, and it's something we do get. We had an incident only a few months ago in a pharmacy where we've got female workers there at the time, and I believe it was a substance misuse patient, and I don't want to necessarily sort of say that was the reasoning, and I think this person had one of the persons possibly just come out of prison, and he wanted to use the loo. But with some of our branches, we just have to be mindful of who is accessing it, and we haven't got sort of, these aren't big sort of branches or shops, and that individual took exception to be told that he couldn't. So he basically started to urinate there in the branch in front of all the staff, as well as other people. And these type of behaviours are things that we're seeing more and more of. Only recently in Portsmouth, there was an unfortunate incident of a stabbing outside of one of our branches, and then the patient sort of came into the branch to get sort of medical sort of care, and thankfully was sort of stabilised and eventually went to sort of intensive care unit in QA. Whilst that had its own incident and isolated, it all has implications on staff, their well-being, what they are able to cope with and can or can't do, and I think that's the bit where, because pharmacy is absolutely on the front line, and in some areas of work, offices, other industries, you won't necessarily get that, whereas with pharmacy, by the nature of what we do, and we are places where we need to see patients, customers, those sort of things, we unfortunately also get some of the difficulties that come with it, and it is something we're seeing a lot more in current times, and there are clearly reasons for that, where sort of funding has sort of been cut in different areas, but it is something we're sort of seeing more and more of, which is difficult to manage, because well-being of staff is absolute priority all the time, but at the same time you also need to remain viable as a business and be there for patients, and this is a very small minority that causes this, but that minority can sometimes be a real hassle for everyone else that's trying to sort of abide by the law and just do the basics. So yeah, it's something that we are sort of seeing a little bit more of late.
Interesting. You say seeing more of it, and you kind of implicate that it's funding issues, but can we go deeper into that? Why do you think we're seeing more of it?
Personally, and I'm not saying I'm an expert on this, but I think the way we deal with perceived minor crime is not great. And we do get sort of brazen thefts of sort of fairly low level value items, whether 100 quid or something or less, and those things aren't necessarily always followed up on through sort of policing and those sort of things. And I think that has an implication, because if individuals are, and look, clearly some of those individuals may have reasons why that is happening, but if you don't have law and order, you start getting into real problems of chaos. Clearly when there are stabbings, the law will definitely take care of that situation, but for me that's almost too late. It's like, how do you deal with issues beforehand? So if individuals are getting away with sort of what we perceive as sort of low level crime, then eventually I think those things escalate more and more. So why can't women work in a pharmacy, in a late night pharmacy at Guildhall? Why can't someone lock up that pharmacy by themselves, say it's a female pharmacist, by themselves, and be safe? I think we need to change our angle of what safe should be. Whereas there can certainly be other countries where you could be a woman, and you could walk around at midnight and be safe. Whereas I think over here we sort of accept that, oh no, maybe that shouldn't be allowed. Whereas we need to sort of flip sort of abusive behaviour, whether that's sort of shouting, and it can be derogatory, or whether it can be sort of infiltrating someone's space and being aggressive, whether it be just sort of theft and swearing and those sort of things. And I think if we really start tackling those issues and early and head on, then those sort of extreme events will then definitely become lessened more and more. So if there was funding, I would really put it into that sort of policing and giving the ability for laws to sort of tackle those incidences, if there is a way. That's for me is part of the issue. And really we should probably have a strategy of what good should be, rather than just sort of accept bad and how we deal with bad there and then. Yeah.
No, I agree with that. Okay, so do you, I guess you do, but do you plan ahead?
Always planning. You have to. I mean, plans keep changing. So from sort of business side of things, you always have to. You have to sort of forecast. So whether you've got sort of the flu campaign that's going to happen in sort of September, October 2025, you got to start your planning now. Whether that's how many sort of flu jabs you're going to purchase, whether it be the budget that happened in October, and there's going to be national insurance changes, there's going to be minimum wage increase, rates increase. As a business, you have to sort of plan, right, those are going to be costs that we're going to get. How do we sort of absorb them and remain viable? Because if you do nothing, then there's going to be real problems. So all these sort of things you have to continually do. So you'll try to plan of things that you sometimes have control over, whether so it's Valentine's Day today, for example. So we were planning for that a few weeks ago, like let's do this, a few promotions, those sort of things. But there are some things that you don't account for, whether it be an abuse that's happened in a branch and how you deal with that, whether it is our NHS N3 line going down and how we're going to sort of fulfill prescriptions, whether it be sort of government decisions that are suddenly saying this has to happen and you've got to prepare for it. So those things are always happening. So you've got to be agile. Sometimes you don't have the immediate answer either. You've got to be agile and slight adjust and just nudge it slightly as you go along a little bit.
Fair enough. So where it stands then with the pharmacies, with the healthcare and the property side, where do you envision it going?
That's a good question. I mean, if you were a couple of years ago when we had the opportunity to get more branches, I would have sort of said, having for me, having a few more branches was a way to sort of protect the business more and actually try to remain sort of more viable and do more things and more contracts. So as a group now, we've got 16 pharmacies across the group, and that seems like a reasonable number for us at this stage. And obviously with all these sort of changes that are happening economically, it's sort of remaining sort of viable and making sure we can continue to be agile. It would be good if it allowed to increase that further from our perspective, just because it allows more opportunity. Because then what we were just saying before with the alliance, it means that you could maybe vie for more contracts, whether that could be sort of certain contracts that we could do in Portsmouth or other wider areas to do with healthcare and things, would be better or easier for us to do. Whereas if we just had one or two branches, that becomes a bit more tricky. But the nature of having more staffing, you could maybe do a lot more. And then in terms of property, interestingly, and it's interesting, we all have our viewpoint on sort of landlords and property and all those sort of things, but the property business at the moment is essentially funding the healthcare business, and if I think if we didn't have that, we would certainly be struggling a lot more. So at the moment, that's what the property business is doing, essentially propping up and helping the healthcare business at this time. And I think with the property, it is the same. It's just making sure you're on top of regulation and all the ever-changing things that are happening there, which is for good, and making sure that those things are sort of happening and being compliant, and those factors are really quite vital. Yeah.
I was going to wrap up there, but just a final question on that. Being a GP, was it for just solely the NHS, or was you also in private?
Yeah, so I've been geared for the NHS. That's just how I've sort of grown up, and most of us in healthcare in this country will always be geared that way. But by the nature of where healthcare has sort of moved a little bit, there are more sort of opportunities, even the ask to go a little bit more into that private world. The private world's always sort of been there, whether you are a heavy goods driver and need to have a medical. Even if you go into an NHS GP surgery, it's often a service you would pay for and things. So what we've done recently is set up an arm which is what we call CQC registered. We call it Access U, and it means that it can do more private type of healthcare things, whether that is seeing a GP, whether it's getting a travel vaccine, whether it's doing certain medicals, and actually we're seeing that sort of increase a lot more in many ways, and those things I don't think will ever, clearly no one's ever going to replace the NHS, but I think by us all living longer and being more aware of how we are medically, and wanting more answers. Sometimes there might be limits with what we can only get from the NHS, and that's where I think some fields are moving a lot more towards. So, a lot of people have gym memberships or Netflix subscriptions, all these sort of things, and interestingly, a little bit that is going more into healthcare rather than only just relying only on the NHS. There's other bits of healthcare which I can see going a bit into that world now.
Interesting. Well, Raj, that brings us to a nice round close. It's been great to hear some of the story. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, great to be here and great to engage.
Well, no, thank you for letting me in, and I look forward to seeing what happens next.
Good.
Nice.
All right.
Part 2, we go out into the street and we ask a question, and we literally went out on Guildhall Walk. It's actually really good location, this is, because that's where we usually go out. So it was it was fitting.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So here we go. Oh yeah, feel free to stop at any time if you want to react.
Private healthcare over public healthcare. Well, I think the NHS is the NHS is really important, but I don't blame people for using private healthcare because obviously the state of what it's like right now is a bit iffy. So,
Is it waiting times? Is it?
Yeah, waiting times. Also, like the quality of care as well. Like personally, like a lot of doctors just don't. They seem to just give you the first sort of treatment to get you out the way. But yeah. It's a mixture of all those kind of things.
Thoughts on people using private healthcare over the NHS?
Well, I've literally minutes ago had a phone call from the NHS and I'm having my surgery. I've been waiting 5 years for it, so I'm going to go team NHS at the minute.
What are your thoughts then on people using private healthcare then?
I can see why, but to some people it's out of our reach, so you have to roll with it, yeah.
No, okay, I'm not from here. So
Okay.
I didn't use both.
Yeah. What are your views then on private healthcare versus public healthcare?
I believe that private healthcare is much better. Interesting. Okay, maybe because people will make more efforts when it's their own business, so will it provide better service? Maybe.
I think it's going to fuck up who can get taken care of in a quite bad way. I think the NHS is a great part of the UK, and to be honest, I think it's going to end terribly. I think we're going to end up like America, where people have got to pay silly amounts of money for things that should be free, and I think it's quite bad. I think it's not something we should be happy about.
Healthcare over the NHS.
Well, private healthcare, I mean, I don't know about private healthcare, but I know the NHS is shit. I mean, twice I've gone to them about I've got bipolar, so I've got to reapply for my licence. And the paperwork going to them rather than me is stupid. And I've just had a doctor's appointment today and he asked me loads of questions about my mental health, but he didn't know about my driving licence, considering the other doctor phoned me half an hour before, said he was going to tell him. It's pretty disconnected if you ask me.
Fair enough. Well, no.
But I don't know about private healthcare. Maybe it'd be.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, isn't it? You get a whole viewpoint and how it is. I think the NHS is tremendous. Firstly, I know there's some people that have sort of used other sort of languages for it, but I don't think you can fault that. If you, and it doesn't matter who you are. So if you're on the street and something goes wrong, an ambulance will come. It will be an emergency, and if you've had a heart attack or a stroke, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're very rich, whether you have no money, you'll be sorted and you'll be taken care of. You'll go to a hospital, all those sort of things, and that's where I think the NHS is tremendous, and you can't really beat that. And I know the individuals spoke about America, and that would be my worry. I definitely don't want to we should not go that way at all. So I think we need the NHS. Where the NHS, I think, it should probably be a wider debate we have in the country, is we should be the best at acute care. So whether it's you have a heart attack, you have a stroke, whether it's preparing for that publicly, whether it's diet, those sort of things, we should be the best at that. So we manage our population the best. And other things like whether it be cancer treatment, those sort of things, let's be world leading at that. That's what we should be really, the top at. And it doesn't matter who you are, we should all have access to it. I think the part where it is starting to struggle, and this is the success of NHS, and this is the success of medicine and where we're going, is we're all getting older, we're living longer, or even we've all got more complex medical issues, like that sort of gentleman said who's got bipolar and dealing with all the paperwork for that. And I think that's where we need to start having conversation of saying, is this something that someone could maybe have, use private healthcare service for, because if we say everything should be done by the NHS, it becomes a little bit unsustainable over time. And slowly things are happening already, whether knowingly or unknowingly. There are some things that we in theory can't get through the NHS. It's something you sort of have to pay for. But I think we've got to have a better debate about it publicly rather than hide saying we're going to lose the NHS. No, we will always have the NHS, but let's gear it to be the best for certain bits of healthcare, which, for me is acute cancer, certain disease, chronic disease management. Those are the real important things. But other bits of private healthcare, whether it be travel, whether it be medicals, whether it be the proactive health, maybe that's the bit that private could take a bit of. And if companies are deciding to maybe pay for sort of private healthcare, or those are things that we bring into HR, those sort of things for those other envelope of conditions that NHS might not be able to do, then maybe that's a way that people could maybe start to sort of afford it, maybe, or So I think it's having that discussion about it that's probably important as well. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
All right.
All right.
It'd be better because you're paying your money, ain't you? But as for the National Health, it's all shot to bits.
Yeah, fair enough.
Go online.
Yeah, I know, right? Private healthcare over the NHS.
Obviously, it depends. If you've got the money for it, then yeah, go for it. But NHS is there if you need it.
Yeah, what are your views? Would you use private healthcare?
I haven't got the money for it.
If you had the money for it, you would, you're saying?
Yeah. Well, it puts less stress on the NHS, doesn't it? So.
Healthcare over the NHS.
Okay, so it makes sense why you would want to use private, considering the wait times and everything else. But it's also very inaccessible and stuff like that. If you have it, make use of it. But also it does disadvantage the NHS, because a lot of doctors that work for the NHS will leave to work for private. So it also creates understaffing issues in the NHS. But that's not by any fault of the people that use private healthcare. That's just the system. So I guess it's not the people that use it, it's more the system. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you for your feedback. What about yourself?
So that's really sort of good answering sort of debate that she's thrown in there, and there's an element of truth in that. So we clearly don't want to lose good people in the NHS that suddenly just gravitate to private only. But I think part of the difficulty now is if we hide behind it and only hide behind the NHS, that's what it is, we just got to keep putting money in it and it's the NHS. What happens is the market starts talking, so people slowly leave. So I think the difficulty with the NHS now is some people are finding the service frustrating, whether bits of the system aren't connecting. And I think also the workforce I know the workforce is finding it really challenging. If you're in a work environment, you're not enjoying it, you're finding it a struggle, you're either going to leave the profession and just think of doing something else, or you may just naturally gravitate towards, I'm just going to go purely private. And I think having that debate now is quite important, because the reason why some people have said private's quite expensive is because it is in a lot, because we're not a country that's geared up for it. So it is. So there's only a few providers, and sometimes those they'll be a bit more expensive. But if we're having a bit more of a wider debate about it, and then other providers started opening up, by the nature of market competition, your pricing would probably adjust a little bit, and then it does become accessible to a few more people. That's something we've tried to do a little bit in this area, to not go crazy on pricings, but obviously still remain viable, because there's a cost to everything. So I think what she said about not losing key staff is important, but also we have the worry in the NHS of good staff, good workers maybe going to places like Australia or other ways abroad because of the wages they get, the work conditions. So I think rather than only also just focus on this country, we have to think actually there's a wider market out there. And if we put blinkers on, the movements will happen anyway. So, yeah.
Very interesting. So.
Well, in terms of like money, I think it's very expensive. But if you don't have the time to actually wait for the NHS appointment, I think you should invest if you have the money or if you really need it. I personally have interviewed like women that were on like a gynecological waiting lists that couldn't wait and they had to pay a ridiculous amount of money just to be seen for like 10 minutes. Woo! But yeah, I think people don't have a choice, really.
Yeah, that's over the NHS.
I think it's a very privileged position to be in if you can be someone to do that. I mean, if I was in that position, I probably would do it because who doesn't want healthcare? But you know, not everyone can do that, so you still feel salty about it.
A question this week is, what are your thoughts on people using private healthcare over the NHS?
Well, I personally wouldn't do it because I think the NHS is a good system and it's free at the point of use and everyone should be able to get access to care. So I personally wouldn't use it.
Well, I think that it's a difficult question, right? Because, I mean, at the same time, it's, you've got a system that is being strangled for funding, being the NHS, but you've also got people who need healthcare as well at the same time. I mean, if they have the funds to do such a thing, I mean, by all means, but at the same time, is it taking away work from a system that needs to be noticed in that field? And it's a loaded question, my friend.
What are your thoughts on people using private healthcare over the NHS, so over public healthcare?
I'm an international student, so I'll say how it goes in my country, but I think it's much better because they provide more healthcare more than just public, and it's much. In my country, I'm from Jordan actually, and it's much better than like public healthcare. The hospitals you go to are much better, much cleaner, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He's from the UK, he could answer that.
And that's interesting. I mean, the one of the ladies before actually just talked about some people maybe even struggling with gynecology appointments and those sort of things. And already I've sort of known patients that have gone abroad for procedures, because they can't get it here or the NHS wait is too long. And subsequently, also, if they were to get it done privately here, it's too expensive. So people are choosing to go abroad, and those patients will come back. And sometimes when they go abroad, we don't quite know what has happened. There might be complications, which more often than not the NHS mops up. So again, having that debate is quite important, because if we are then going to be a bit more open and willing for, say, private to happen here, I think it's better that way, so that we see what those patients are getting, we can follow what's happened, decision-making process, and obviously the more providers, then obviously the pricing should hopefully sort of fit that, whereas if there's a fewer providers, it's quite expensive. And in regarding some individuals that sort of already live abroad and have what they perceive as better systems out there, I think it's just that sort of perception that they get. So, clearly when we are going in some NHS places, the buildings are a bit old and dilapidated and infrastructure's not quite there. I think the services, it's mostly all fine. There's no sort of issues there. Whereas I think when some people come from overseas and come here, they're a bit sort of shocked by how some of the appearances are of some places. I don't necessarily agree with him saying that, services here are bad and those sort of things. It might just be that sort of appearance of how things look. But again, I think we can learn from some of the things they do abroad, because the individuals sometimes, and I'm not saying it's something we don't have here, may have a bit of more of awareness of where they need to access bits of healthcare, because they have to. So, if you have a gastro issue, you might end up seeing a gastroenterologist. If you've got a child, they might end up seeing a paediatrician and those sort of things. So that awareness piece of people being aware of what they need to do when they are using a bit of private is also not a bad thing. Whereas I think sometimes here we just default of, I'm just going to see my GP for this, or I'm just going to go to A&E, and we're not really thinking of what do we really need to do that. And I think maybe having that debate and wider discussion is quite important. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Question. That's a good take, though. That's a good take. Thanks for that.
I think it's just more reasonable now because, like, with like the NHS and all like the wait times, you're waiting for like 6-7 hours at least. Whereas, like with private healthcare, you get seen like nearly instantly, and I think they're more helpful. So I think nowadays it's better to get the private care than go through the NHS.
Interesting.
The time is really bad in NHS. Really bad.
Well, all my family have been nurses over the years, so they used to be almost train me from when I was a little kid to sort of always support the NHS and be dedicated to the NHS. I thought as you get older, you're thinking, I can see it's a much more complex issue. I've looked at the price of healthcare and considered it, so it's a very complex issue. I can see both sides, really.
Yeah. What would you opt for aside from your family?
Try to support the NHS as much as possible.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, and I think supporting the NHS, funnily, is to have this debate and discussion. And I can see why it's difficult for politicians, because I think it's quite a tricky debate to have, because I think almost when they have it, it's deemed that they're anti-NHS. Whereas I think actually by having it, you're going to be more pro it, because if you continue the way we are, it's going to be a bit unsustainable. Whereas we should change our discussion and say, let's be the best and pioneers of these, acute care, cancer care. We already have Oxford, Cambridge in terms of research. Other big sort of drug companies are often wanting to be in this country. Mm-hmm. So we do the research and development. We're sort of pioneers in that in this country. But from the NHS side of things, we almost need to have that discussion of what do we want it to be for the future, because we're all living longer, more complex healthcare needs. So can it continue the way it was set up, or do we need to evolve it a little bit more?
Interesting. Well, that brings us to a nice close then, Raj.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah.
Cool. Any final words?
No, I really enjoyed that. Like I sort of said, it was good to sort of have that discussion about healthcare and private healthcare and sort of other things about me. So no, thank you.
No, it's been a pleasure, Raj. It really has. But yeah, thanks again, and I look forward to seeing what happens next.
Yeah, good stuff. Cheers.
Happy days.
All right.